Live. So, welcome everyone to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bolin. Today, we actually have a very new guest to the podcast, Derek Sainsbury. We will be discussing the topic of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. Coincidentally, today is actually the day of the Irish presidential election as well. I just voted a few hours ago, so I did not actually plan on that happening, but rather apropos today. So yes. I also have my St. Joseph Smith T-shirt as well. So
there you go. There you go. He would be quite proud of you voting.
Yeah. When I used to work for BHR, we actually had those pins, and one of them was Joseph Smith, 1844, Annex Canada. And I'm sure we'll discuss some of these plans for Canada later. But before we kind of discuss the topic today, Derek, first of all, thanks again for coming on. And for those who may not have heard of you before, how about you give an introduction to your good self? What's your background? Have you always been a Latter-day Saint? What's your education? And also, what got you interested in Latter-day Saint history specifically, but this very narrow topic as well, like Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, as well as his use of electioneering missionaries and other topics?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was born in the church. My family had some issues. We were active, inactive kind of a thing. And I became active towards the end of my high school days and went on a Latter-day Saint mission. And a big part of that was a seminary teacher who had a big impact on my life. And so when I came back from my mission, I decided to do that for a living. So for 27 years, I worked in the Seminaries and Institutes program of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, mostly, just locally in Utah. I got a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's of public administration. And then I got a PhD in American history with an emphasis on the American West and religion in the American West. What got me interested in Joseph Smith's presidential campaign is I love history and I love politics. So when I found out, this has to have been 5-6 years after I returned from my mission, was the first time I came across any information about him running for president. And so I started looking for sources, and there really weren't many as far as secondary sources addressing just a few small articles, and that wasn't very satisfying. So when I started my PhD, I decided that's what I wanted to do my dissertation on. And what fascinated me about the campaign was that these missionaries were being sent out to not just teach about the Book of Mormon and about the restoration, but also to campaign for Joseph Smith. I thought that it's got to be a very interesting mission to combine religion and politics like that. So I wanted to see if I could get to know some of these missionaries a lot better. And it ended up being over a decade. I was ABD for forever, because I just kept finding more and more and more and more and more. And I'm still finding some, tangentially in other research I'm doing. So, before my dissertation, we thought probably about 330 missionaries went out. And by the time of my book, it was 631. I turned my dissertation into a book in 2020. And then now I'm almost to 670. I think it's 668. So it's a lot of missionaries. And so that's kind of how I ended up in this place, and was started at BYU about 5 years ago in religious education there in the Department of Church History and Doctrine. And I'm actually currently continuing that research by doing a dual biography. I'm writing a dual biography right now of Joseph Smith and Robert Kennedy Sr. as the only two assassinated presidential candidates, and looking at their lives and their electioneers and just all that kind of stuff, their assassinations, their impact, that kind of stuff.
That sounds fascinating. And do you have any ETAs to when that book will come out?
We're just trying to work on deciding on a publisher. It'll probably be sometime in the spring or summer of 2028. for the
Cool.
next presidential campaign. So,
Cool. And of course, like the book he wrote is Storming the Nation, The Unknown Contributions of Joseph Smith's Political Missionaries. It was published by BYU and Deseret back in 2020. So, and
yeah,
it's recommended. There's also a Kindle edition for those who, unlike me, prefer electronic. So
I could see your books.
that's just some of them. It's,
Yeah,
but
I'm
yeah,
sure it is.
yeah. Yeah, but no, that's good. So, of course, like today's topic is actually on the area of one of the areas of your speciality, and that is Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. Fortuitously, though, like my old workplace, the B.H. Roberts Foundation did produce like a very good article, as well as like producing some of the primary research on that. So, if you, I would, before we kind of begin, like, might as well just plug that as well. It was a good resource, as well as your book and Spencer McBride's very good book as well on the topic, which you actually reviewed positively a few years back. So
Yes.
maybe we should actually begin with the question, like, why did Joseph Smith run for the presidency? Why would he or like the Latter Day Saints in Nauvoo at the time just like put their vote, the block vote, if you will, behind like say a Whig politician or a Democrat politician? Why did Joseph Smith, a religious leader of all people, decide to actually throw his name into consideration for the U.S. presidency of all things?
Right. That's a great question. And was kind of the question I wanted to know too when I first started researching all of this. It really goes back to the idea of really early in the church, they're just trying to build Zion. They're not really caring about the nation or nations. They're just trying to build Zion, this independent, community, society that would be ready for Christ's return. And when they get kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri, the Lord gives some revelations to Joseph Smith, Section 98 and Section 101, that talk about the Constitution, how parts of it are inspired, how the saints are supposed to look for good, wise, and honest men and back them in government, that they're supposed to go to the government for redress, that constitutional law is what God wants. For all people. And so the saints start to, from that point on, become more and more politically involved. The kicking out of the saints in the extermination order in 1838 begins with Latter-day Saints not being allowed to vote on election day, and a big brawl, literally a literal brawl breaking out where people's heads are split open and laying on the ground, and rumors fly that people have been killed. And that just kind of snowballs to the extermination order, and the saints are thrown out of Missouri. And of course, Joseph Smith is incarcerated along with other leaders and eventually allowed to escape. When they when he gets to Illinois and starts to regather with everybody, um, he has all the people from Missouri write down their affidavits of their losses, so that they can seek redress. So he's going to take those to Washington, D.C., to the Congress and to the President of the United States, who's Martin Van Buren, as allowed for in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And so he does that with several others. He goes back east and meets with the president. He has an introduction from one of the Illinois legislators, and Van Buren, famously says, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you," because he doesn't want to act against Missouri, which is a strong Democratic state, and he's running for election that year in 1840. And the petition before Congress, everything takes Congress forever. So he's got some free time, and he actually goes on a little bit of a speaking tour between D.C., New York, and Philadelphia. And we have some good primary sources from newspapers and from others, not non-Latter-day Saints, who are in those audiences, about how persuasive he is about their cause, meaning what had happened to them in Missouri. So it becomes kind of a minor celebrity, if you will, in the papers back east. Well, it's taking too long, so he heads back to Nauvoo, where they're starting to build this city. And the committee doesn't even bring it before the full Congress, so they're not going to get any redress. And when Joseph returns, he's and finds that other part out. He's furious. He's furious against Van Buren. He's furious against Congress. They've gone to every level of government. They've gone to every branch of government, like God had asked them to do, and nobody's going to help. And so he realizes that he has to do something different. That he can't rely on government to protect his people. And lucky for him, he's just decided to be in a state that's almost evenly split between Democrats and Whigs. And all of a sudden, you've got thousands of Latter-day Saint men voters. So both parties are very anxious to court, if you will, the Latter-day Saints for their votes. And so they are able to get through a charter for their town, for their city, Nauvoo, which doesn't give them any more powers than any other charter in the state. It's just that it gives them all the powers of all the different charters in the state. And what that allows them to do is have their own city where they can vote for their own leaders to be also government leaders, right? And also receive a commission to create a militia, which they'll call the Nauvoo Legion, which by the time of Joseph's death is the largest city militia in the United States, and about one eighth the size of the U.S. standing army. So they've got that to protect them from mobs if it comes again, and they've got a government where they feel like they can secure their own rights just by living within this city. And then what happens is basically in the next few years, starting in 1840, Joseph Smith says, I am not voting for Van Buren ever again. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to vote for the Whig candidate, General Harrison. And the way Joseph votes, without specific instruction to the whole crowd, the Saints vote, right? They're following him as a prophet, so they follow in that case. What happens over the next few years is you have the Latter-day Saints voting for whichever candidate or party Joseph's voting for, in the sense of they're going to do the best good to protect us, right, at the state level or at the national level. So that by the August election in 1843 for Congress, it looks like Joseph's going to vote Whig, and for several different reasons. And at the last, a couple days before the election, Hiram Smith announces that it would be better for the church to vote for the Democrats. And Joseph Smith gets up in a meeting and says, look, I am committed to vote for the Whig candidate in this congressional election. I'm going to honor that commitment, but you guys vote what you think's right. And I've never known Hiram to be wrong. And so the Saints vote for the Democrats, and that raises a lot of ire amongst the Whigs, who are kind of the majority in Eastern Illinois. And so Joseph's now realizing that this block voting has between parties, because block voting in itself is not the issue. For example, for almost a decade now, and for decades to come, Catholic immigrants who become citizens of the United States are all Democrats. And so the idea that all the Catholics are voting Democrat is not a problem, because it's always there, right? It's not shifting back and forth. And so Joseph, sensing this, he writes to the major candidates for the next year's presidential campaign, 1844 campaign, the top five that are kind of in the newspapers, and basically saying, what will you do if you're elected regarding us? And obviously you'll get our support, right? If you're willing to help us, you'll get our support and our votes, which we're coming. There's two things with that. One, it did control Eastern Illinois elections, but it also to some extent was heavily influencing and in the perception of newspapers back east, was pivotal for the state of Illinois. And so, surprisingly, actually, three of the candidates write back. That shows you how influential Latter-day Saint votes were, or were thought to be in the national, the national situation. And but then none of them offer help. And so, as the leaders of the church in January of 1844 are trying to decide, so what do we do now, right? Nobody's going to come to our aid. Well, their solution with that before was they create their own thing, they do their own thing. And so, on January 29th of 1844, church leaders nominate Joseph Smith to run for president as an independent candidate. And it's not, sometimes, especially in the past, it's been talked about as some kind of protest vote or kind of a third way so they don't have to vote for either of the parties. But in the journal that's kept just of that very day, right from the beginning, it's a serious campaign. So first of all, they're going to send, Joseph says on that first day, we're going to send electioneers, or we're going to send our missionaries throughout the country. And they have oratory enough to put a president in on the first go. And second, they are talking about creating a system of electors. That would be the electoral college electors, right, who actually vote for the president of the United States in our kind of different system here, and a plan of how to create those in each of the states. So it's a serious campaign. Does it have a serious chance? No, but it's a serious campaign. It's not just some haphazard thing. In fact, within 2 weeks, he has a political pamphlet that's written, printed, and 1,500 copies are off to the major newspapers, major political movers and shakers, those in elected office all throughout the country, and starts to get commented on for the rest of Joseph Smith's life. And so initially, I mean, he's really running because no one's going to help them. And he wants to defend, he makes it very clear that he wants to defend religious freedom. And not just for him, as he said back in 1843, that he was just as willing to die for a Baptist or a Methodist as he was for a Latter-day Saint. And he feels like the government is corrupt. He feels like nobody's coming to the aid of religious minorities like himself and like Catholics. And he's going to do something about it. And his revelations talk about supporting men that are good, wise, and honest. He considers himself to be that. The Latter-day Saint community considers himself to be that. And so he's willing to throw his hat in the ring to protect all of that.
Thank you. That was very good as a very thorough background. So, do you maybe like say some very specific questions here? First of all, Sidney was his vice presidential campaign. He was running as his vice president, but before that, there was a fellow by the name of James Arlington Bennett. Could you comment on like why he was changed and switched with Sidney Rigdon during the presidential campaign?
Yeah, sure. So initially, the idea is to use George Arlington Bennett, who is a influential man in. He lives on Long Island in New York. He has a school, the Arlington Academy. He has several books published in different disciplines. He's very well known and very liked. And he had actually been baptized the year before in 1843 by Brigham Young, although he'll later call it just kind of a frolic in the sea. But he was actually a baptized member of the church and was actually because of his influence, the Joseph actually gave him a commission in the Nauvoo Legion. And Bennett had written that fall about, hey, what if I move out there? You guys could support me for governor, and I would be governor um, and protect you, right? Kind of a thing. And at that point, Joseph Smith wasn't willing to get involved like that. This is like November and of 43. But now that he's in, the letter they write to Bennett about please join the campaign, right? You start in New York and work your way this way, and our missionaries will start Nauvoo and work our way this way, is like, hey, why are we playing the game of one state when all the states are on the table, right? So what they were hoping with Bennett is he had connections, he had influence, and so hopefully that would bring more legitimacy and help. Now, what happens is that he's from Ireland, and they you can't so that they believe someone tells them that he's born in Ireland, which means according to the Constitution of the United States he could not be vice president of the United States. The scholars that have
And also
looked
the
at
Irish
this,
are untrustworthy.
well, I don't know about that, but 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 the interesting thing is that the scholars who've done the most research on this have all concluded that he was actually born in the United States. And so he actually would have been eligible and probably would have accepted had they kept it that way. Because by the time he gets his letter, they've already gone through another candidate who was a non-Latter-day Saint in Kentucky, who was very friendly to the Latter-day Saints. Some of his family and some of his slaves actually had joined the church. And Wilford Woodruff knew him very well and had stayed at his house and several times on his missions there in Kentucky. And so they actually wrote him, and we don't have any idea if he received it or he certainly didn't respond, or at least if he did, the letter hasn't survived. And so by then, Joseph had created what was called the Council of 50, which was this confidential group who considered themselves to be the beginning of the political kingdom of God on the earth. And they in their deliberations, and they end up being the ones, right, who lead the campaign. And in their deliberations, when they're trying to decide what we're going to do now, that's when they nominate Sidney Rigdon to be vice president. So that's why he ends up eventually on the ticket. And then in May, in the first state convention there in Illinois, is placed on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate, which requires him to then leave Nauvoo because the vice president, according to the Constitution, has to be from a different state. And so he gets up and moves back to where he was originally from, which was near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And by the time he gets there and starts campaigning, Joseph Smith is dead. And so that's why he ends up there on the campaign instead of the others. He had recently reconciled himself with Joseph right before General Conference in April of 1844. So they had been estranged. Joseph had actually asked the church to throw him out of the first presidency back in October of 1843 in General Conference, and the church actually voted against Joseph to retain him, and they had come to some kind of reconciliation. And so that's how he ends up on the ticket. He's the third choice, but there he is. And since he'd been such an amazing preacher and speaker, I mean, he was captivating. That also seemed to make sense, and maybe he could make some headway in Pittsburgh, in the Pittsburgh area.
Now, of course, as with any candidate, Joseph had his own platform when it comes to, say, various issues. So maybe if we were to take like a few point by point, like what was Joseph Smith's own platform on the topic, and how different was it to, like, say, the cultural milieu and the political milieu of the time? So the first one, let's start off with a softball one, not controversial at all: slavery.
Well, so that's a great question. In fact, that's actually how he starts his platform, right? I mean, he goes in starting off by saying, how can this be the place of independence? How can this be of the Declaration of Independence, of the Constitution, when we have millions of enslaved people? And his views on this had evolved to the point where, in section 98 of the Doctrine and Covenants, or 101, I can't remember right now, but in those revelations, the Lord says it is wrong that any man should be in bondage to another. And so Joseph is taking that, taking other scriptures that talk about the equality of man, and he's saying we should do it. We should free the slaves and hire them. He says in his platform, hire them to work just like any other man. And his plan for that is to purchase their freedom by cutting the number of congressmen and the pay of congressmen, as well as selling the rest of the federal land that is unorganized from the Louisiana Purchase, and by thus, remunerating the slaveholders for their property as it was considered in those days. And he hoped to have that done by 1850. So in the next 6 years from that time period, it's pretty audacious, but it has precedent. The United Kingdom had already begun doing this with Caribbean slaves. When they had earlier outlawed slavery and the slave trade, they made an agreement to purchase a long-term agreement of purchasing the freedom of the slaves in the Caribbean, which went well into the 1900s of them paying off that debt. So there was a precedence for it. After Joseph's death, there will actually be a couple of people uh, who put it forth again, right? But it's Joseph. He's the first one. He's not the first presidential candidate because in 1840 there was a party started, a third party called the Liberty Party, that was an abolitionist party, and they had called for it, but he's the second candidate to call for the abolition of slavery and had a specific plan to actually bring it about where he believed both sides could agree on it because people were being paid for losing their property.
Okay, and the next topic is his views about territorial expansion. I think something about annexing Canada was involved somehow as well.
Yeah, yeah,
So we'll
yeah.
briefly discuss
So
that one.
yeah, in so America's looking to advance west. It's always been that way. Anytime we could. Texas at this point is an independent nation, and we are joint owners with England, with the United Kingdom in the Oregon Territory, and the rest of the Western continental United States belongs to Mexico, although there's very few actual Mexicans that live in that area. And there's a lot of call for westward expansion into those areas of taking sole control of Oregon, of negotiating with Texas to join the Union. In fact, that happens during the campaign. And in fact, Joseph's Council of 50 is actually negotiating with the president of Texas as well, Sam Houston, about the Latter-day Saints going down there. And so it is in the milieu, of course. Later, it's going to be called this idea of manifest destiny, right? That it's just that's what should have happened, that happened all along. The idea is in the air; it hasn't been named yet. But Joseph in the April conference has said that all of North and South America is Zion. So he had expanded the definition of the geographical space of Zion. And so as he comes up with a platform, he says, look, Oregon rightly belongs to us. We should annex Texas. And we should offer Mexico and Canada entry into the United States if they will have us to spread liberty the way we see liberty. And then he says it with permission from the American Indian tribes, move into their lands, in the western continent and the middle and western part of the continental United States. So yeah, very aggressive plan of expansion that kind of was more on the Democratic side of the two parties, Democratic and Whig. In fact, the person who will actually win the presidency, James K. Polk, a Democrat, he kind of Texas gets annexed. He saber rattles with Mexico on purpose. Most historians believe he created a battle on purpose to start a war with Mexico, which of course ends with United States victory and the taking of all of the rest of the continental United, what we call today the continental United States. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted.
You're good. You're good.
Joseph also had like some interesting ideas about the prison system and trying to reform that. So,
Yeah, and like all of these things we're talking about here, actually, they are in the dialogue, right, of the nation of the two parties, but they're also springing from his own personal experience. And with this one, it's very personal. His father, when he was young, had been in debtor's prison, which still existed in 1844. And prison systems were just kind of really beginning to grow. And Joseph Smith himself had been wrongly imprisoned for several months in Missouri. He had been arrested, dozens of times, as has been documented. In Nauvoo, he had been arrested for to be extradited, but had been saved by Nauvoo's um, legal charter. And so this is coming from a very personal place for him as well. And his idea is pretty dramatic. It is basically to free all but the most serious, that one, that there should be no debtors' prisons at all, and two, that minor infractions, they should all be freed and told to do better next time, basically. And serious offenders like murder, um, that they would try to be re-educated, reformed through the prisons being turned in his words, into seminaries of learning, right? And again, he's taking this also from the idea in the Book of Mormon about the Lamanites who in Third Nephi, who teach the Gadianton and Robin prisoners and convert them. It's either convert or die kind of a thing. And so again, he's getting his ideas from his theology as much as from his personal experience. And the idea is that they should be, the ones that stay in prison should not only be taught the gospel, taught how to be a good person, but also employed on public works, right? So that they're doing something good for the community.
cool. And another topic he had some interesting takes on was the issue of banking. Of course, like he was part of the failed Kirtland banking experiment, in 1837 and thereabouts. But what was his views about like the banking system for the United States under his presidential campaign?
So that here he's throwing his weight more towards the Whig side. So his platform is kind of hitting everybody, which he's going to say in his in that platform this simple sentence: "Unity is power." And so he's reaching out in both directions. And yeah, like you mentioned, the banking's coming from his own problem too. After Jackson destroys the second bank of the United States, banking, of course, is local, not just local, but not necessarily well done. Wildcat banks everywhere, and the Panic of 1837, which wipes out the Kirtland Bank, also wipes out thousands of banks across the United States. And those banks were needed. There's no national currency. And in these places where there isn't a lot of currency, gold and silver coins, they need some kind of medium to be able to, not just barter. And that medium usually comes from small investments and backed by land, right? Small amounts of money backed by land. And he's saying, look, that this system isn't working. Let's do what the Whigs are saying. Sorry, back up just one more thing. The Democrats have been running the state of Illinois, and its bank had collapsed after the 1837. They were major, major, major in debt, and so he's looking around and saying, look, if we have a central banking system, they can stop things like this from happening, and they can create a means by which fluidity of money and investment is available everywhere in the United States. The difference, though, that he had from the Whigs and say from what would become later the Federal Reserve is that for him, there would be a national bank and then a state bank in each of the states, and people would be elected to run those, not appointed or not private citizens in that sense, but that they would be elected. So again, that's more of a people's approach, more of a democratic versus a Whig elite approach. But again, coming from his own personal background and also what's going on and kind of what he's been trying to do the same thing in Nauvoo without creating a bank because of what happened last time by using tithing basically as the tithing that's being put in and the land that's being put in Nauvoo as kind of the medium of trade. So yeah, that one's out for the Whigs, and that one actually gets debated a lot in the newspapers, believe it or not, between Whigs and Democrats. Um, I mean, that's the thing in Joseph's platform that gets the most traction as far as conversation in the national press.
And he also addressed like two topics that even today in the US continue to be hot button topics: Congress and the powers and abilities of the US president himself. So, what was his views on these issues and how did he differ, or what were the similarities between him and the other parties and other politicians at the time?
Great question. So, with Congress, when he was there petitioning for the Saints, right? He was just blown away about how in love with themselves the congressmen were, how well they dressed, and how they had all these little manners, and it kind of shook him up a little bit, like uh, what are we doing? Why are we putting these people here? So his these kind of people here, right? And so his reform for Congress is to cut the number of people in half. There's too many there, he's saying. So create the ratio of citizens to congressmen, double the number of citizens. There's just too many of them there, and too much then room for as he sees it, corruption. And then he says they should be paid like a farmer. So they're being paid $5 a day, which is, in that time is a good amount. They should be paid $2 a day like a farmer. So he wants to lower their pay. He wants to cut them in half as far as numbers, because from his point of view, they're uppity. From his point of view, they don't have the people's interests in mind. And of course, they didn't help him. And so he has that view of them. As far as the presidency, in this time period, we have what's been called in political science and history circles the states' rights doctrine, right? This idea that the individual states of the United States had control of their states, and that the federal government and federal law was only for the federal things that the federal government touched. What that means practically is that the Bill of Rights that's in the Constitution is not applicable in the states. So, for example, they get kicked out of Missouri, right? There are laws of the state of Missouri that say you can't kill, you can't steal, and you have freedom of religion. Obviously, those laws were not enforced. In fact, to some degree, were uh, violated specifically by the the government, the state government, right? So Joseph's saying, like, the president should be able to interfere. In fact, he writes in the pamphlet, the governor himself can be the mobber, which, in his point of view, was what had happened with Missouri Governor Boggs. And so he wants to give the presidency the power to be able to intercede within the states to defend the rights of the federal government, the Bill of Rights. Now, the reality is Washington did do that. Washington put down the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. Um, So it's really more a matter of will as well as states' right doctrine. For example, in 1832, when South Carolina decides that they're just going to not keep the tariff, that they're just going to say the tariff doesn't exist. President Jackson, who's a states' rights guy, he sends the army down to South Carolina basically and says, "Oh, really?" Right? And so they negotiate it. So it's not a hard, fast rule, but it's the way it's been interpreted. It's the culture of the time. And unless you have something that the president's really willing to intervene in, it's not going to happen. And again, this is actually ends up being very, just like most of these things we're talking about actually come to pass, except for the cutting of pay and the size of Congress. Um, they almost all come to pass. And this one does, obviously, with the 14th Amendment, which after the Civil War, which calls for the equal treatment under the law. So it doesn't matter if you're in Missouri or if you're in Washington, D.C., the rights of the Constitution are supposed to apply to everyone equally.
Okay, no, that's a very good overview of some of what he was standing for in terms of his presidential campaign. The next question is something I think you might know something about, just a while guess, but he's used some missionaries for his campaign. I don't know if that's outside your pay, but I'm joking. He's written a book on this, so yeah.
Yes.
So, do you want to maybe discuss the history of his use of missionaries for his campaign
Sure.
and how successful were they? Where did they go? And anything else you want to discuss about that?
Yeah. How many hours? Just joking, just joking.
Just five.
Like I mentioned earlier, from day one of the campaign, that's the plan, that they're going to send men out to both campaign for president of the United States and also, um, uh, be normal missionaries like they've been doing for 14 years, spreading the gospel. And, even on that first day, they're already thinking about specific people and specific places. So what they do is they put a call out through their newspapers and through other means for as many men as possible to come to General Conference in April of 1844. And so the last session of that General Conference is a Monday meeting on April 9th, where there's 1,200 men there. And Joseph Smith is not there because in the culture of the time, a president did not campaign for himself. That was seen as wrong, as ambition. And so the Council of 12 and Hiram Smith, the assistant president of the church, run the meeting. And they explain in the meeting that we're going to send out missionaries to preach and to campaign, to take the views, Joseph Smith's views, that was the name of the pamphlet, with them to both publish in great numbers and distribute in great numbers. They were to electioneer with everyone that they could find. They were going to be assigned, most of them, to where they grew up or where they spent a significant amount of time. So they already had a small network of people that they could work with and then grow it from there. They were told that the 12 would travel and that conferences would be set up in each of the states where the members of the 12 would show up and have a state convention and nominate electors for the Electoral College. And initially, and then they, they're very straightforward about that it's going to be both things. Brigham Young, let me just find this quote here for you. Brigham Young says, "This is a fire that cannot be put out. We will turn the world upside down." So it's very energetic. Um, uh, the cheer goes up for Joseph Smith for president of the United States, and it echoes. The minutes of the meeting talk about it echoing through the town. It's so loud. So then when it comes time to volunteer, of the 1,200 men, about 271 sign up on that day. And we have the minutes of that, and they're already being assigned to states that they're from generally, and they're signing up for 3-month missions, 6-month missions, or 12-month missions. And by the following week, when all of the assignments and all of the conferences are published in the church newspapers, there is 300 and there's 300 about 300 of them, and they are all assigned to different states. There are one or two presidents assigned to each state who are presidents of the campaign for that state, as well as the mission, the religious missionary work. And uh, and off and off they go. Once that list is out, those missionaries start to leave Nauvoo, sometimes alone, sometimes in large groups. There's one group of about 60 that leave in May. And so all the way up until all the way up until till the Nauvoo Expositor incident, you've got missionaries leaving, almost on a daily basis to go out to their assignments. And generally they had a companion that they were going with, but then they would sometimes switch companions and so forth. Some had money to be able to travel. So there's one group there's several missionaries that are going to the same place in say Vermont, and there's two poor missionaries from England, English converts, uh, who walk the whole way, and they get there after Joseph Smith's dead. They campaign and preach along the way, but they don't get to their assignment till after Joseph's dead. There's a couple of others that have means, and they take steamboats and canal boats and railboats, and they're there in 2 weeks. So it's really different. It's diffused. They send missionaries to every state. There aren't many, generally single digits for those in the deep South. Uh, Illinois ends up having the second most with about 70, and New York has by far the most, over 140. And other people decide to leave after those official assignments are given, and they're given assignments. And so there's another group of missionaries who just decide, after the official beginning of the campaign, hey, I want to do this. Or sometimes they're approached by Joseph Hiram or someone else to go and do it. And then locally, at the local branches, they will hold these meetings where Saturday they campaign and Sunday they preach. And they'll hold local conferences, and then of course the state convention. But they'll hold these local conferences, and then they'll often call those local men to serve local missions in that area to both campaign and preach. We've got people that are in this campaign who are 50 years old. We've got the youngest is 16. Some of them have been around since the first months of the church. Some just literally got baptized, and a couple days later they're out on the campaign trail. How do they preach? Well, they do what they normally do to preach. They get in a town and they rent a hall, or they put up an advertisement to preach in the schoolhouse or whatever, and they do both. When they're in homes, they do both, meaning they do both politics and religion. And then, of course, like I mentioned, they have these big conventions that draw a lot of non-Latter-day Saints. In fact, for example, the Ohio one is held in the Kirtland Temple, the campaign rally. Several of the apostles are there on their way back east, and Lorenzo Snow is actually the one in charge in Ohio. And it seems that the plan was, because we have several of the state campaign presidents who do this, it seems like they have this organizing meeting, the state convention, and then they assign their missionaries into specific uh, congressional districts within that state. So we know Michigan was done that way. New York was done that way. Ohio was done that way. Massachusetts was done that way. So that seems to have been the plan, after they have their state convention or their state conference, um, to go out and do this. And so um, they're reported on in newspapers. So everybody knew, basically, if you read a newspaper, which most people did, or knew somebody who read a newspaper, anywhere from Maine to Louisiana, people knew Joseph Smith was running for president of the United States. It doesn't mean they liked him or that they or that or anything like that, but there's a reporter in St. Louis who writes an article that gets republished all over the United States. And in that article, he says some people think Joseph. I'm summarizing, obviously. Some people think Joseph is and the Mormons aren't serious. They're dead serious. Like I just saw 50 guys come through here on their way. So, look for them. They're on their way out to come campaign, and they show up in newspapers and non-Latter-day Saint journals and writings all over the country. And in looking at their journals, meaning the missionary journals, we get a certain pattern of how it goes. In some places, they are accepted. Some people think their ideas are um, good, but really don't like Joseph Smith. So um, they're kind of worried about that, about the mixing of church and state. In other places, they are persecuted. We have at least one that's tarred and feathered. We have mobs that chase several others. Um, we have plenty of opposition of, trying to break up meetings or tearing up our pamphlets. Or in New York, they're holding a mass meeting and somebody purposely breaks the gas pipe to break the meeting up. The largest rally in the campaign actually happens days after Joseph's dead in Boston. There's 6 or 7 of the apostles there. They rent this big concert hall, and that seats about 2,000 people, and it's full. And there aren't that many saints in in Boston to fill that. And in fact, there's a women's rights activist who interrupts the meeting. And then later in the meeting, they're there all day. Uh, a couple of young Whigs start a fight on purpose, and the police are called, and it devolves into a big brawl, which causes the meeting to end prematurely in panic, and they have to hold it somewhere else. The second day of the convention somewhere else. So they're getting a lot of opposition. There are some places, notably in spots in Ohio and a spot, an area in New Hampshire. There's an area in New Hampshire where they hold a meeting with non-Latter-day Saints, and the resolutions that come out of that are that we resolve that we'll vote for an independent candidate in all elections. And they don't specifically say they'll vote for Joseph Smith, but the one of the other resolutions is that Joseph Smith is worthy of that vote. And so we have some places where they're making some headway, because there is some dissatisfaction that is occurring out there because politics has become a game in the past 2 elections. It's become a very partisan game. It's become very different from previous American history, the elections themselves, and even the depth of power of the parties. And so the missionaries are finding some kindred spirits of those who have a distaste for both parties. But the issue is they also, because all they know about Joseph Smith is through the national media, they also have a distaste for Joseph. And so there's a great quote from let's see, Lorenzo Snow, where he talks about the fact that as he went around Ohio as the campaign president, he said, people thought there were people who thought this was a glorious thing, and others who thought it was a species of insanity. And so that's kind of it's kind of a way to address it. That, and of course, the second was the more likely result was that they thought it was crazy and or dangerous. Um, but there were some places where they were starting to have effect around the nation. They were starting, and they do have hundreds of baptisms. They baptize hundreds of people on this mission, and so yeah, and that's why, by the way, you always, if you grow up in the church, you always hear that Joseph Smith is killed, and that most of the leadership is away on a mission, and that's the mission. Right? They're back east. The apostles are back east. Sidney Rigdon is in Pennsylvania. All these other elders, hundreds of them, and one woman, by the way, who was called to go with her husband, are all over the country and not in Nauvoo when Joseph's killed. And so that plays into the succession crisis as well later.
Thanks for that. And of course, like you've
Yeah.
written an entire book on the topic, so thanks for condensing it so much. I know
Yeah,
it's kind of
yeah,
difficult.
yeah. Yeah, if you want, read the book for specific stories. There's a lot of great stories, and
Yeah,
some that didn't even make the book because editors don't like really big books. So,
tisk tisk.
right?
But going on, like you mentioned, the Council of 50. Now, I think like a fear was like, first of all, the Council of 50. Many people had this fear, like this is like Joseph Smith trying to set up a theocracy, and that's antithetical, like say, to American idealism, church-state separation. So one, was the Council of 50 actually a theocracy? And two, did Joseph, as part of his presidential campaign, want to establish a theocracy? And what's and if not, like why did he crown himself king, in the Council of 50? So if you want to address that, because it will deal in later, but he's like the reason for his death as well. So
Right, right, absolutely. So, in on March 11th of 1844, he creates this council, and we have to backtrack just a little bit to be able to see why this council comes about. In 1838, Joseph is already advocating for a political idea of aristarchy. That's a word we don't use anymore. In fact, it's in the official motto of the Church of Latter-day Saints in 1838 that we go for aristarchy with three exclamation points. Aristarchy is government by good or excellent men. So not because you're the richest, not because you're nobles like an aristocracy, or because you've earned it like a meritocracy, but because of the goodness of your nature and the your goodness, your honesty, your wisdom, which is exactly what the revelation had told them to seek for. So Joseph's thinking about this idea of aristarchy. Then, when he gets to Nauvoo, we talked about the Nauvoo Charter. The Nauvoo Charter actually combines in the city council effectively all three branches of government. So you're on the city council, but you're also on the city court. And the mayor of the town is the head of the city court and is also, as mayor, the executive, but also the head of the city council. And so what you have is a system. Joseph doesn't really name it until the campaign, but he's creating a political idea of theodemocracy, is what he's going to call it in the campaign. And the idea there is that it's not a theocracy in the sense of um, God tells me and I tell you what to do, and that's how government will work, but that good and honest and wise people are found in a council system, right? So it's not just one person, it's a council system, and that they together seek the will of God and then present that will to the people, who then vote to follow it, right? And so he actually introduces this. It's implied in the Nauvoo Charter and how they're going to live it, but he also starts um, he does this with the Relief Society. So when the Relief Society is created, he says that because, just to backtrack, the women that wanted to start a relief society similar to the other benevolent societies in the United States had Eliza Snow create a constitution for it, because in those days everybody wrote a constitution for everything, right? And she brought it to Joseph Smith, and he's like, "Oh, this is a great idea to create this, and this is probably the best constitution I've ever seen, but the Lord has something different for you." And so that's when he organizes the Relief Society. And in that organizing meeting, he says that a presidency should be called, the president of the Relief Society and counselors, and that they are the Constitution. Later, he'll call it the living Constitution. In other words, the revelation that's received in the council of these three women is what will lead the Relief Society, and then as they present that to the Relief Society, and it's by common consent accepted, then that is the law of the Relief Society. And then you start to see that as well in the elections, right, of Nauvoo. Even when we're working with non-Latter-day Saints, like in county elections or state elections, we're nominating people to, non-Latter-day Saints to run, and all the saints are backing them. That block voting we were talking about earlier. So the aristarchy, the good or excellent men are nominating who should run, and then saying that to the people, and then the people are voting for it. So that's kind of the idea that then gels completely in the Council of 50. Which actually has a different name. It was called the Council of 50, colloquially, because that's the number of people in it. But its actual name was the Kingdom of God and His laws, with the keys and power thereof, and judgment in the hands of His servants, Amen Christ. So literally the political kingdom of God on earth, run by His servants. And Joseph will, in these meetings, talk to them about the same thing. He'll say they create a subcommittee to write a constitution, right, for this organization, and they try, and it's just not working well. And Joseph Smith says that's because that's not what we're doing, right? We're a living constitution, and that's where he gets, by revelation, this title for the official name of it, right? So it's this idea that Joseph Smith has called by inspiration 50 good and wise and honest men, and to show that it's something supposed to be separate from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that in a pluralistic society, it can't just be the Church of Jesus Christ. He actually admits three trusted non-Latter-day Saints to be a part of the council. And they're later on, the members of that council, in years later, will say that's why Joseph did that, is he was showing that this council has to be able to, it's very token representation, right? Three out of 50, but the idea is there. So when this council is created, on the very first day, they are talking about creating this theocracy, or as Joseph's going to call it, a theodemocracy. But they're not talking about it in the United States at that point. At that point, they're like, should we go to Oregon, or should we go someplace in the West, or should we go to Texas? And they actually send a member of the council, Lucian Woodworth, down to negotiate with Sam Houston to create a colony of Latter-day Saints in Texas, which at that point is an independent republic. And they're actually going back and forth, and there's a land dealer involved as well, who shows up in Nauvoo around the time of Joseph Smith's assassination. And so there's serious effort there. They do create one to go talk to the English government, although that person never leaves on that particular mission. So the idea is like looking for somewhere to go outside of the United States where they could have their own government, like they do in Nauvoo, and whether that's with an agreement with the Texas government or the Oregon government, or just out in the West where they can create their own Nauvoo, big style, free from outside interference. So on the outside, it looks like theocracy, obviously. Joseph saw it differently, as being a theodemocracy, because he believed in this idea that that the righteous should be the ones in charge of government. That was the original. He felt like that was the original intent. It kind of is a play off of the idea of republicanism in the early republic, not the party that comes later, but the idea of the best of us being elected to represent everyone else, and them being wise people who are disinterested in economic things because they don't need money or corruption. The George Washington types, or the Thomas Jefferson types, or the James Monroe types. Joseph sees, in fact, he spends a lot of time in his political platform saying that's the way it should be back when we were doing it like that. Okay. So by April 11th, when this ceremony happens in the Council of 50 about kingship, by then they are basically thinking we go to Texas, we go somewhere out west, or Oregon, or we win the election. If we win the election, we can establish theodemocracy in the sense that the prophet of God will be president of the United States, not the kind of more full on theocracy that would exist if we moved in a group here or here. But right, Joseph ends his political platform saying, I will speak to Jehovah on behalf of all the people of the United States, right? So they are thinking about that idea of having their own government somewhere to protect them, like Nauvoo had worked for 5 years. And in the end, they put all their eggs in the basket of the election, and they send most of the council out to follow the electioneers that they've already sent out. Now, as far as the coronation meeting, um, it's we finally got the council of 50 minutes, so we got a little bit more insight onto what happens in that meeting, and he is anointed to be king over Israel. So the wording is king over Israel, which is different than king over the United States or king over all peoples or whatever. The issue and of course that's, I mean, it's kind of anti-American, a monarchy. But again, if we look in the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon teaches in the end of Mosiah that the best form of government is a monarchy if the monarch is good, right? And they're also, again, in this millenarial background of that Jesus could be coming in the near future, and that he needs to have a government set up on earth, and that government will, of course, as even the Bible mentions, will be a monarchy of Christ as King of Kings. And so Joseph's role as a king is not only fits into that, but it fits into the wider Latter-day Saint endowment experience that's happening at that time amongst a select group. That the endowment is not yet public in the sense that it's being offered to all Latter-day Saints. So this idea is that they're kings, kings under the King of Kings, right? So that's their way of looking at it as theodemocracy. Now, obviously, somebody in the council, in fact, Joseph says, "Don't mention me as king." And the term they use is proper source, like, so proper source of authority. But somebody had to have leaked what was going on in the Council of 50, because in the Nauvoo Expositor, you get the idea that he's been crowned king and that he wants to take over the United States and rule it as a theocracy, which is not what the minutes are saying, but is very useful if you're trying to get somebody killed, right? As far as something to rile people up, and it's in some ways. In my scholarship, Michael D. Quinn, some others, we believe that's the reason for the destruction of the expositor more than plural marriage, because plural marriage, they had that whole debacle with with Bennett in 1842, where the first time they sent missionaries out throughout the country to talk about something other than just religion. They went out to disclaim all of the things or refute all of the claims that Bennett was doing in his book tour around the United States about polygamy. So the Nauvoo Expositor does talk about polygamy, but that's kind of old news. Like the rumors of that have been happening all throughout the 1840s there uh, in um, in Nauvoo. But the people who end up doing the killing, the conspiracy that ends up doing the killing, they're not doing it because of polygamy. They tell you why they're doing it. They think Joseph is a tyrant. They think he's out of control. They think he's made himself king of the United States, and they say so in the Nauvoo Expositor. And so, I think Joseph realizes when he reads the Nauvoo Expositor that I think if it was just about plural marriage, the reaction would have been different. But the accusations in there about church and state and tyranny and so forth, he understands because of some of the specificity of the language that somebody's talking about the Council of 50. And if that's taken wrong, which would be very easy to do, right? Um, that's just a death knell for his campaign, and ends up being the death knell for him when he decides to destroy the expositor.
I'm kind of glad you kind of mentioned that because I was about to ask like what role his campaign played in his and Hiram's death. So, do you have anything else you want to add to that? Um,
Well, everybody at the time, Latter Day Saint, non-Latter Day Saint, called it a political assassination. The Latter Day Saints, Brigham Young. Let me pull up his quote. But everybody, you look at the the men who did the deed. They're talking about it as he's out of control politically. Latter-day Saints in their journals, they are talking about it's because of his politics that they were going after him. When Brigham Young eventually takes over the church with as the Quorum of the 12, he ends Joseph's campaign formally. Obviously, he's dead, so the campaign's dead. But formally, with this, he says, "As rulers and people have taken counsel together against Joseph and have murdered him, who would have reformed and saved the nation, it is not wisdom for the saints to have anything to do with politics, voting, or president making at the present." So everybody at the time, both inside and outside of the church, aren't saying he's murdered because of polygamy, aren't saying he's murdered because of the doctrine of plurality of gods. They're all saying the same thing, which is it's over politics. And of course, he is mayor, right? There is from what's on the outside seen as abuses of power, but he's also running for president, and it's in the national news, and there's missionaries everywhere. And there's this perception that shows up actually in many newspapers, an exaggerated amount of votes that the Latter-day Saints have, something in the hundreds of thousands, right? Which is just crazy. But perception is reality. No, not a lot of people are actually living in Nauvoo, and that started clear back in 1842, where newspapers were talking about, hey, there's this empire growing on the border of the United States that's going to have a lot of political power. So, yeah, I think if we're being honest, it's a lot has to do with his politics. But why? But that doesn't mean he's not a martyr. Like, why? Why is he involved in politics? He's involved in politics because they're trying to create Zion, because they're trying to create the place for Jesus to return to. They're trying to implement the revelations about how to deal with government the best way they know how. So for me, it's still a martyrdom. He's doing it's because of the church, right? That he's doing, from his point of view, what he's doing because of the church, not as something completely separate. So had he not run for president, would he have been killed? Possibly. Like down the road, there could have been more things, shake out. If it had just been about plural marriage, I really doubt there would have been the kind of reaction that actually does end up happening. So yeah, it plays a major part. And if you don't believe me, then believe the president of the church, because he wrote a book back that he's never gone against, that he's spoken about even last year, called the Carthage Conspiracy, where he went and looked at he co-wrote that, and he went and looked at all the trial records and all the evidence, and he specifically calls it a political assassination. So yeah, I mean, we of course we want to emphasize that he died for the restoration. That's exactly why he died, for the restoration. And the people that have an issue with this, I often help them try and understand that Jesus was executed for political treason, which is basically the same kind of thing that's going on here, right? So Jesus is convicted by the Sanhedrin of blasphemy, but the only way to get him killed is to make him a threat to Caesar. And so that's the argument of treason they take to Pilate, who eventually does it. The same thing happens with Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith and others. They are arrested for riot in destroying the press. And once they're released on bail, they're immediately arrested for what? Treason, right? And that way they can't get out of jail. And like I said, everybody in the time period is saying it's because of politics.
Yeah, you mentioned that Carthage Conspiracy that President Oakes wrote with Marvin Hill, which is an
Yes,
excellent
correct.
book.
Yep.
Also, there was a very good collection of like transcriptions of the relevant newspaper accounts would be by the late LeGrand Baker, Murder the
Yes.
Mormon Prophet. But fortunately, like this, it's now available for free as a PDF as well. It's a very lengthy text, like 1,000 pages, but a lot of really good stuff. So
Oh yeah, it is. That is a great book. I'm glad to hear it's free for everybody. He has,
yeah,
that's kind of where I started my newspaper research, was with the foundation that he had created, and kind of went out from there. There's also another book called Junius and Joseph that is also through Utah State, was printed by Utah State, by two amateur historians who they were trying to create. They saw it and tried to show the evidence for a wider conspiracy from the Whigs, possibly even all the way to Henry Clay himself. And that's got a lot of great um, source material, and that's free as a PDF. I don't buy the argument, going back to Clay, that it was a conspiracy and that the Whigs were primarily the drivers behind it. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. But so that's another source, a place to go to get source material about what's being said during the time period.
no, that's perfect. And this kind of goes into like say the end, but before we wrap things up, like any recommended books? Like, of course, when it comes to Joseph Smith in general, there's Bushman's biography, which touches upon this. I'm sure in Rick Turley et al., the forthcoming book, whenever that will be, like maybe a decade, there's going to be a lot of more information. And of course, there was the Joseph Smith papers for, like, say, the primary resources.
Right.
Is there any particular books, hint, hint, you would like to plug and recommend for people who would like to delve more into this?
There you go. Storming the Nation. Joseph Smith's, I can't get it to focus, but yeah, Storming the Nation, it's available. I also have several art. If you just search me online, Derek R. Sainsbury, I've done several articles about that connect the campaign to religious liberty. I did one on the only female campaigner, and used her life as a way of showing how Latter-day Saints were denied denied religious liberty all throughout the 1800s. It was nominated for an award and unfortunately didn't win, but it's some of my best stuff, I think, using her as an example, the only female electioneer campaigner, because she campaigns for that her whole life. And even in the Relief Societies that are created, before the polygamy legislation starts to get real bad, she's in there, talking about campaigning for president, and we need to stand for religious liberty. And her life story is being kicked from state to state to state and losing someone in her family each time. And so, there's lots of other stuff I've done on it. I'm working currently with the church history library for their missionary database of giving them all of my material for each of the individual missionaries that I found, right? Because it's almost twice now what we knew, well, over twice what we believed before my work. And so that's another thing. You can even go to stormingthenation.com is a website I have where I've put up all the names of the electioneers. So if you have a relative that you know was male and alive in the United States, anywhere in the United States, not just Nauvoo, in 1844, you can go look, and you might be surprised to learn that you have part of your family history is you had someone out campaigning for Joseph Smith for president of the United States.
Cool. Also, my friend, it doesn't just focus on Joseph's run for presidency, but my friend Craig Foster co-authored a book with Neil
Yes.
Brinhurst, The Odd Couple of Mormon Studies, as they like to call themselves,
Yes.
the Mormon
Yes.
Crest
Yes.
the Mormon Crest for Presidency, which is now
Yeah.
in its second edition. So it has a chapter
Yeah.
on Joseph Smith as well as other LDS who have ran for presidency. So
Yeah. Right up to Mitt Romney.
yeah, yeah. So Derek, I really do appreciate this. Like, before we close, like, any other final comments you want to make about the subject, or any other? And also, are you working on any other projects at the moment that you might want to share with listeners?
Well, the big project I'm working on is that biography I mentioned earlier. I've gone to Boston on a couple of research trips to the JFK Presidential Library, where Robert Kennedy Sr.'s papers are. And literally with the help of my family, we photographed thousands and thousands of documents. And I have a small army of research assistants who are tracking down, with our modern technology, internet things, they're tracking down any campaign workers that are still alive, right? That campaign was in 1968. I just had an interview with one yesterday who was, leading uh, Senator Kennedy through the kitchen when he got shot, and was the one who eventually ends up getting the gun from Saran. So it's been really cool. We're getting lots of firsthand accounts of these local campaigners for Robert Kennedy. We're going to keep doing that for a little while. And then, like I mentioned, we'll try to have the book out by 2028 to be able to compare uh, Joseph and Joseph's life, Joseph's campaign, Joseph's assassination, Joseph's impact with that of Robert Kennedy as the only two assassinated presidential candidates. And then I guess the other thing that's also in my book, Storming the Nation, which kind of ends up being the central thesis of it, is what I discovered. Like, I found all of these hundreds of missionaries, right? I mean, it's a lot of data to work with. And tried to find out as much as I could about who they were before the election, during the election, and after the election. And what comes out very strongly is that if you were an electioneer, you were much more likely after Joseph Smith's death in the continuation of the church to become a church leader. It's kind of like the Zion's camp, Quorum of the 12 kind of thing, and 70 kind of thing. So like the next four apostles are all electioneers. Um, in the next decade, 55% of all leadership positions are given to these campaigners who only represent 15% in 1844 and diminishing men who could be called. So it's not like a straight, smoking gun 1-to-1, but these men that had gone out and campaigned, um, they end up being the majority of the bishops, the majority of the probate judges, which had a huge role in the development of Utah. And the central thesis I have of that is basically, what did the campaign do with these missionaries? Well, it created a cadre of men who could replicate the theodemocracy of Nauvoo all over, in hundreds of towns all over the Great Basin, which is what they do. If they're the bishop of a town, let's say you're the bishop of Provo, when the mayoral elections come up, you're automatically on the ballot, and everybody votes for you. And so you're not just the mayor and bishop, but you're also the mayor, and so that had far-reaching effects into the 18 um, into the 1880s, and then even in the 1890s, when the campaign president of Illinois, or excuse me, of Ohio, who wasn't a big church leader in Joseph Smith's time, is president of the church, and Lorenzo Snow. So there's this residual effect that has a big impact on what happens for the rest of the 19th century. That these men and one woman have uh, an uneven amount of influence based on their mark in the general population. And I think that's for three reasons. I think it's because they believe in theodemocracy, or they wouldn't have gone out and risked their lives by campaigning and preaching at the same time. I think there's trauma bonding that happens. They all learn about Joseph Smith's death out there together, in small groups, but that there's this trauma bonding amongst them, and the 12 are with them. And of course, the 12 have been going around. The 12 are the ones that have called them, set them apart, sent them out, and have been out there with them. So they're familiar with them. They're familiar with their work. They're familiar with their character. And so I think all of those things help influence why they're selected more than others for the future leadership of the church.
Well, well, we're actually at the end of the episode, but I think this has really been informative and add like a couple of wrinkles that are often overlooked when it comes to discussions about this. So I really do appreciate this, Derek. If someone
Of
wanted to
course.
reach out to you, if someone wanted to reach out to you, is there a good way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, on my website, Derek R. Sainsbury, or stormingthenation.com, or even just Derek underscore Sainsbury at byu.edu.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, again, really, thank you again, and maybe we could actually have you on around 2028 to discuss the forthcoming
Yeah,
volume as well.
would love to. Would love to.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds fascinating. But again, thanks for your time. I really do appreciate it. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And enjoy the rest of your day and have a great week.